Will Naples be destroyed in another volcanic eruption like Pompeii? That's what we'll find out in today's episode of Fake or Fact. Hi, everyone. I'm your host. And while it may seem like Mount Vesuvius erupting and destroying Naples is a far-fetched idea, there are some scary similarities between the eruption that destroyed Pompeii in 1709 AD and the possibility of an eruption happening again today. So let's dive into it to find out if this really could happen. For our first fact of the episode, here's a scary one. Mount Vesuvius has erupted 7 times in the past 390 years. While you may not think that's very often, it means that on average, Vesuvius erupts once every 56 years. And with its last major eruption occurring in 1944, you might be due for another. But before you start making plans for a bunker, there is some good news. All 7 eruptions in the last 390 years have been relatively small compared to the massive eruption that destroyed Pompeii. So rest easy, Naples residents. Well, maybe. Now, before we get into how devastating the eruption that destroyed Pompeii was, let's talk about what actually happened to the city. Because, contrary to popular belief, the eruption didn't destroy Pompeii right away. In fact, Pompeii wasn't even covered in ash until 18,000 years after the initial eruption. So why do we associate Pompeii with being buried in ash and pumice? It's because of the Plinian eruption. For our next fact, here's a quick overview of what a Plinian eruption is. A Plinian eruption is a type of volcanic eruption that is characterized by the formation of a plume or column of material that rises high into the atmosphere, reaching heights of up to 30 to 60 kilometers or 19 to 37 miles. This type of eruption is named after Pliny the Younger, who described the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in a letter to his friend Tacitus. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius that destroyed Pompeii was a Plinian eruption, but it was also a VE5 eruption, which stands for Volcanic Explosivity Index. A VE5 eruption is one of the largest types of volcanic eruptions, releasing more than 10 billion cubic feet of material and having a crater size larger than half a mile across. However, it's important to note that the VE is a logarithmic scale, meaning that each whole number represents a tenfold increase in eruptive magnitude. For example, a VE6 eruption is 10 times more powerful than a VE5 eruption. So while the eruption of Mount Vesuvius that destroyed Pompeii was a major event, it was not the largest eruption in history. That brings us to our final fact of the episode. Here's why Mount Vesuvius erupting and destroying Naples today would be much worse than the destruction of Pompeii. If Mount Vesuvius were to erupt today with the same VE5 rating as it did when it destroyed Pompeii, it would be catastrophic for Naples. Unlike Pompeii, which was a small town of only about 11,000 people at the time, Naples today is home to over 4 million people. Additionally, unlike Pompeii, which was located on the outskirts of the Roman Empire, Naples is now part of the densely populated European Union, just 20 miles from the capital of Italy. With such close proximity to a major city, an eruption of this magnitude would cause widespread destruction and loss of life. Furthermore, unlike Pompeii, where the majority of the population was enslaved, most of the people living in Naples today are free and would likely not heed the warnings of scientists and evacuate the area in time. An eruption of Mount Vesuvius in modern times would also have serious global implications. The ash and debris ejected into the atmosphere could have a devastating impact on global temperatures, leading to a volcanic winter. Global temperatures could drop by several degrees, disrupting agricultural production and causing widespread famine. The economic impact of such an eruption would be staggering, with the cost of damages and lost productivity potentially running into the billions of dollars. The transportation and supply chain disruptions could also have ripple effects felt around the world. Now imagine all this, not just affecting Europe, but the entire planet. So while the destruction of Pompeii was certainly a significant event in history, the potential impact of a similar eruption in Naples today would be much greater due to the city's proximity to other major cities and its location in one of the most densely populated regions of Europe. Now, while this is a lot of doom and gloom to end on, it's not the end of the world. At least we don't think so. There are volcanoes that have much larger eruption sizes than a V5, such as the Erupta eruption in 1912, which was a V6 eruption. But we know those volcanoes aren't going to erupt anytime soon, right? Right. So now that we've discussed the facts, let's move on to the fake part of the episode. How did the myth of Naples being destroyed by Vesuvius come about? Well, it started with a miscommunication between Pliny the Younger and Pliny the Elder. You see, Pliny the Younger wrote a letter to his friend describing the eruption of Vesuvius as it happened, but he had his uncle, Pliny the Elder, who was in charge of the Roman navy, deliver the letter. Unfortunately, Pliny the Elder wasn't great at his job, and instead of delivering the letter directly to Tacitus, he decided to show it to other high-ranking Roman officials. Soon, the description of the eruption was all over Rome, but there was one small problem. Pliny the Younger never described Pompeii being destroyed. In his letter, he only describes the eruption and the ash cloud. The reason why everyone thinks Pompeii was destroyed is because a few hundred years later, someone added that detail to the story. But where did that come from? Well, there's one theory that says that because Pompeii was covered in ash thousands of years later, people assumed that it was destroyed during the eruption. But if that's true, why didn't they realize that the people covering the city were Herculaneum residents who fled to Pompeii after their own city was destroyed by the eruption? Unfortunately, that question can never be answered because Herculaneum was destroyed in the eruption, along with all the evidence that could have cleared up the confusion. But the fake doesn't stop there. Some people say the eruption didn't even destroy Pompeii. Instead, it was destroyed by earthquakes that hit the region in the following years. But that theory doesn't hold up either, because archaeologists found buildings that were damaged during the eruption but were repaired, only to be destroyed again by earthquakes. So we know that it was the eruption and not the earthquakes that destroyed Pompeii. So now, let's take a look at what would happen if Vesuvius erupted with the same force as the eruption that destroyed Pompeii. First off, the eruption wouldn't be as big as you might think. The eruption that destroyed Pompeii was a Plinian eruption, but it was also a V5 eruption, which means that it was pretty big. But it wasn't as big as some other eruptions. The biggest eruption ever recorded was the Toba super eruption in Indonesia in 74,000 BC, which was a V8 eruption. The eruption of Vesuvius that destroyed Pompeii was much smaller, releasing about 10 billion cubic feet of material. That's about 1/10 of the amount released by the Toba eruption. But the damage done by the eruption would be devastating nonetheless. The immediate area around Vesuvius would be completely destroyed, including the city of Naples. The eruption would also cause widespread crop failure and famine throughout Italy and much of Europe. The ash and debris ejected into the atmosphere would block out the sun, leading to a cooling effect on the global climate that could last for years. But the good news is that the eruption wouldn't be able to destroy the entire planet. The amount of material released by the eruption is just too small compared to the amount of material in the Earth's crust. So will Naples be destroyed by a volcanic eruption? No, not in the way that Pompeii was destroyed. However, if Vesuvius were to erupt today with the same V5 rating as it did when it destroyed Pompeii, it would be devastating for Naples and the surrounding areas. But if you're worried about a small eruption happening anytime soon, don't be. Scientists closely monitor Mount Vesuvius, and there are no signs of an eruption in the near future. Thanks for watching.